In the remote wilderness of New Brunswick, where July nights stretch endlessly and the nearest neighbor lives 12 miles away, there exists a farmstead that authorities buried in classified files for decades. The story I'm about to tell was deemed too disturbing for public knowledge. An account of 5 escaped convicts who sought refuge from an elderly widow in 1970, only to discover that some forms of hospitality come with a price that defies human understanding. What investigators found in that barn challenged everything they believed about the nature of evil itself. How does a family maintain such twisted secrets across generations? What drove a mother's love to such unthinkable extremes? And what evidence was so horrifying that seasoned officers refused to speak of it for years? Justice was finally served, but the methods used will leave you questioning the very foundations of morality. Prepare yourself for what's coming next, because this revelation will test everything you think you know about human nature. Subscribe to join our mission of uncovering buried truths, and comment your city and time. We love seeing where these dark histories reach. The truth that emerged in the New Brunswick Provincial Courthouse during the winter of 1971 defied every assumption investigators had made about the Blackthorn case. Court records from Marcus Blackthorn's trial revealed that the frail elderly woman who had lured 5 escaped convicts to their deaths was not a woman at all, but a 28-year-old man who had perfected an elaborate disguise passed down through 3 generations of systematic killers. The deception ran so deep that even experienced RCMP officers had been fooled by theatrical techniques learned during military service using prosthetics, voice training, and his deceased grandmother's clothing to maintain a murderous charade that had claimed lives for 8 decades. The Blackthorn farmstead had been strategically positioned in 1890 by Jeremiah Blackthorn along the only viable road connecting Dorchester Penitentiary to the Maine border, creating what prosecutors would later describe as a human trap disguised as sanctuary. Property deeds recovered from the Westmoreland County Registry revealed the family had purchased nearly 400 acres of isolated wilderness, ensuring their nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away across treacherous terrain that discouraged casual visitors. The location provided perfect cover for activities that required absolute privacy, while the family's public persona as devout Christians offering shelter to society's unwanted gave them access to the most vulnerable potential victims. Sheriff's logbooks dating back to 1892, discovered in the basement of the old Sackville Courthouse, documented an alarming pattern that previous investigators had dismissed as coincidental. Deputy Sheriff Edmund Walsh's meticulous handwriting recorded an unusual number of missing person reports along the Sackville Road, with 7 separate cases of travelers who had been seen heading toward the Blackthorn property but never reached their intended destinations. Each report contained disturbing details: abandoned horses found wandering with blood on their saddles, personal belongings scattered in ditches, and witnesses who claimed to have seen the same helpful old woman offering assistance despite knowing the real verity. Blackthorn was decades younger. The 1896 disappearance of traveling salesman Robert Mackenzie provided the first concrete evidence of the family's methods. Mackenzie's horse was discovered 3 days after he failed to arrive in Moncton, the animal's saddle soaked with blood and strange gouges marking the leather that veterinarians described as inconsistent with any known wild animal attack. Provincial police records show Mackenzie had been carrying nearly $200 in cash and a sample case filled with jewelry, none of which was ever recovered despite extensive searches of the surrounding wilderness. Witnesses at the Dorchester Inn testified that Mackenzie had specifically mentioned seeking shelter at the Christian Woman's Farm after local residents recommended the Blackthorn property as a safe haven for travelers caught out after dark. By 1903, the pattern had become impossible to ignore, yet official investigations remained limited by jurisdictional disputes between provincial and federal authorities. 3 separate families reported encounters with an elderly woman matching Verity Blackthorn's description, but their testimonies contained a chilling inconsistency that suggested something far more sinister than simple mistaken identity. The Gunderson family swore the woman appeared to be in her 70s, while the Pratts described someone who looked barely 50, and the McLeans insisted she seemed ancient beyond measure, her voice carrying the weight of decades of secrets. All 3 encounters occurred within a 2-week period, despite witnesses providing identical descriptions of the woman's clothing, mannerisms, and the exact words she used to offer sanctuary. Deputy Marshal William Crane's 1804 investigation marked the first official recognition that the missing persons reports might represent coordinated criminal activity rather than random misfortune. Crane's military background tracking outlaws across the Dakota Territory had taught him to recognize patterns that local law enforcement missed, and his detailed report to federal authorities contained observations that would prove prophetic decades later. His notes described finding an excessive number of abandoned personal effects scattered throughout the woods surrounding the Blackthorn property, including spectacles, pocket watches, and distinctive brass buttons that suggested the belongings of multiple individuals who had met violent ends. The ICE investigation that should have exposed the truth was deliberately sabotaged by bureaucratic indifference and the family's carefully cultivated reputation as pillars of the community. Church records from St. Patrick's Catholic Church show the Blackthorn family made substantial donations throughout the 1890s, funding repairs to the bell tower and contributing generously to collections for society's most desperate souls. Pastor Michael O'Brien's preserved sermons from this period praised the family's Christian charity toward those whom others would shun, creating a public image that made accusations of wrongdoing seem not just unlikely, but blasphemous. Crane's request for additional resources to conduct a thorough search of the property was denied by federal authorities who deemed the isolated location too expensive to properly investigate. His frustration permeates every page of his final report, which documented clear evidence of foul play but lacked the manpower and funding needed to pursue justice. The report's concluding paragraph contained a warning that would prove tragically accurate. The Blackthorn property represents an ongoing threat to public safety that will continue until proper investigation is conducted, regardless of the financial cost or political inconvenience involved. The 1818 fire that destroyed the original Blackthorn barn provided the most damning evidence yet of the family's criminal activities, though official reports buried the most disturbing details beneath layers of bureaucratic language. Sackville Fire Department records, retrieved from water-damaged archives during the 1970 investigation, contained witness statements describing screaming heard from inside the burning structure that firefighters initially assumed came from trapped livestock. However, the official inventory of recovered remains listed bone fragments inconsistent with standard agricultural animals, along with personal effects from multiple individuals arranged in deliberate patterns that suggested ritualistic behavior. Fire Chief Donald McLeod's confidential report to provincial authorities described finding human teeth embedded in the barn's foundation, along with metal objects that appeared to be restraining devices designed for controlling human prisoners rather than livestock. The report's most chilling detail involved the discovery of a leather-bound journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard, containing what McLeod described as detailed accounts of activities too disturbing for inclusion in official documentation. Provincial authorities ordered the journal sealed and classified, ensuring the evidence would remain hidden for over 50 years, until the 1970 investigation finally brought justice to light. The Blackthorn family's response to the fire demonstrated their remarkable ability to manipulate public perception while covering their tracks. Within weeks of the disaster, they had constructed a new barn using lumber purchased from 3 different suppliers across 2 provinces, paying in cash that witnesses noted came from an unusually large roll of bills, despite the family's modest apparent income. Community members who offered to help with reconstruction were politely declined, with Verity Blackthorne explaining that her family preferred to handle their private affairs without outside interference, a statement that would gain sinister significance once the full scope of their crimes was finally exposed. The 1923 fire that consumed the rebuilt Blackthorne barn marked a turning point in the accumulation of evidence, though authorities would not recognize its significance for nearly 50 years. Sackville Fire Department records, discovered during the 1970 investigation, contained witness statements that revealed the true horror of what had been hidden on the property for decades. Volunteer firefighter Thomas McKinnon's sworn testimony described hearing humans screaming from inside the burning structure that continued for nearly 10 minutes before being replaced by a silence more disturbing than the cries themselves. Fire Chief Harold Davidson's official report documented the discovery of bone fragments scattered throughout the barn's foundation, but his private notes contained details too disturbing for public consumption. The bones showed evidence of deliberate cutting and arrangement, suggesting they had been displayed rather than simply discarded after death. More troubling still were the 47 pieces of personal jewelry found melted into the barn's metal framework, including wedding rings, pocket watches, and distinctive brass buttons that matched missing person descriptions dating back to the 1890s. The firefighters' inventory revealed a collection of personal effects that defied explanation through conventional livestock operations. Among the recovered items were 15 sets of false teeth, 23 pocket watches stopped at various times, and clothing fragments from at least a dozen different individuals. Provincial Fire Inspector William Crawford's classified report noted that the teeth showed signs of having been deliberately extracted from living subjects, while the watches appeared to have been kept as trophies, their hands marking what investigators later determined were the approximate times of various disappearances. Eugene Hartwell's 1931 sworn statement to provincial police provided the first documented proof of the Blackthorne family's elaborate identity deception. As the rural postal carrier serving the isolated Sackville route since 1920, Hartwell had maintained detailed delivery logs that created an invaluable documentary trail spanning over a decade. His testimony described delivering mail to 3 distinctly different women who all claimed to be Verity Blackthorne, despite obvious differences in age, physical appearance, and vocal patterns that should have made the deception impossible to maintain. Hartwell's postal records contained meticulous notes about each delivery, including his growing unease about the family's suspicious behavior. His October 19, 30 entry documented delivering a package addressed to Mrs. V. Blackthorne to a woman who appeared to be in her 70s, while his November 15th entry described the same recipient as appearing barely 50 years old with completely different facial features. Most disturbing was his December 3rd notation, which recorded delivering Christmas mail to a woman who claimed to be the same person, but whose voice carried the trembling weakness of extreme old age, despite appearing younger than either previous encounter. Railroad conductor Samuel Morrison's logbook entries provided crucial evidence about the scope of the Blackthorne crimes, tracking suspicious passengers who regularly disembarked near the isolated property but never returned to complete their journeys. Morrison's Canadian National Railway records, maintained with military precision from 1923 through 1964, documented 41 separate cases where passengers purchased tickets for destinations beyond Sackville, but disappeared after leaving the train at the rural stop closest to Blackthorne property. Each disappearance followed an identical pattern: lone travelers carrying visible cash or valuables, often recently released from prison or traveling without family connections, who might report them missing. The 1937 provincial police raid on the Blackthorn property yielded evidence that should have exposed the family's criminal enterprise decades earlier. Inspector Robert McPherson's official inventory listed physical proof of systematic murder hidden throughout the house, including 47 pieces of jewelry stored in labeled boxes, 23 pocket watches arranged chronologically by date of acquisition, and 15 sets of dentures preserved in glass containers filled with formaldehyde. The basement storage area contained personal effects from victims spanning nearly 50 years, organized with meticulous care that suggested the family viewed their crimes as a form of collecting rather than random violence. McPherson's confidential report to headquarters contained details deemed too sensitive for public release, including the discovery of a second leather-bound journal documenting murders with clinical precision. The journal entries, written in 3 distinct handwritings representing different generations of killers, provided explicit instructions for victim selection, disposal methods, and maintaining the family's cover identity. One entry from 1935 described the generational handoff process, detailing how younger family members were trained to assume the identities of their deceased relatives to ensure continuity of operations. Coroner Dr. Benjamin Morse's examination of the barn foundation revealed bone fragments from significantly more individuals than could be explained by normal livestock operations. His medical training allowed him to identify human remains mixed among animal bones, including skull fragments showing evidence of deliberate trauma and long bones that had been systematically broken to fit into confined spaces. Morse's private notes, discovered after his death in 1974, contained estimates suggesting the remains of at least 30 individuals had been processed through the barn facility over multiple decades. The most chilling evidence emerged from church records proving that Verity Blackthorn had died of natural causes in 1934, yet neighbors continued reporting encounters with the Immortal Widow, offering shelter to travelers. St. Patrick's Catholic Church burial records confirmed her interment in the parish cemetery, complete with witness signatures and pastoral documentation of her final confession. However, provincial police surveillance reports from 1935 onward documented continued sightings of an elderly woman matching Verity's description, leading investigators to conclude that other family members had assumed her identity to continue the murderous tradition. The identity transfer was revealed through genealogical research conducted by RCMP Detective Sergeant Harold Dunphy, whose systematic approach uncovered the truth behind the family's supernatural reputation. Court records from the 1970 trial documented how Rebecca Blackthorn, Verity's daughter-in-law, had undergone extensive physical transformation using theatrical techniques to assume the deceased woman's appearance. Rebecca's background in traveling medicine shows provided her with knowledge of herbs and chemicals that could artificially age her appearance, while her study of Verity's mannerisms allowed her to maintain the deception for over a decade. The 1944 incident involving 2 escaped German prisoners of war provided definitive proof that the Blackthorn operation had continued uninterrupted despite the supposed death of its original architect. Military records from Camp Gagetown documented the escape of prisoners Klaus Weber and Heinrich Müller, both last seen heading toward the Sackville area after breaking out during a work detail. Multiple civilian witnesses reported observing the distinctive prisoners' uniforms near the Blackthorn property, yet despite extensive manhunts involving 3 provinces and international cooperation with German authorities, no trace of the escapees was ever found. Search teams equipped with trained dogs and military-grade equipment scoured hundreds of square miles surrounding the property, but found only scattered pieces of prisoner-of-war uniforms and personal identification papers buried in shallow graves throughout the woods. The search operations classified report noted that the burial sites showed evidence of lime treatment to accelerate decomposition, suggesting the perpetrators possessed sophisticated knowledge of body disposal techniques. Military investigators concluded that the escaped prisoners had been systematically murdered and disposed of by someone with extensive experience in hiding evidence of violent crimes. The final piece of evidence from this period came from Rebecca Blackthorne's own confession, recorded during her deathbed statement to Father Michael O'Brien in 1945. O'Brien's sealed parish records, subpoenaed during the 1970 trial, contained Rebecca's admission that she had continued the Lord's work by maintaining the family tradition of eliminating society's undesirable elements. Her confession detailed the elaborate preparations required to assume Verity's identity, including the procurement of period-appropriate clothing, the study of historical speech patterns, and the careful cultivation of community relationships that would support the deception for years to come. RCMP Detective Sergeant Harold Dunphy's assignment to the Sackville Detachment in 1952 marked the beginning of the most systematic investigation the Blackthorne case had ever received. Dunphy's military police background from World War II had taught him to recognize patterns that civilian law enforcement often missed, and his first review of the accumulated missing person files revealed a chilling consistency spanning over 60 years. His initial report to headquarters documented 23 separate disappearances along the same 12-mile stretch of rural road, each involving individuals who had been seen accepting help from an elderly woman whose physical description remained impossibly consistent across multiple decades. Dunphy's fingerprint expertise, acquired during his service in occupied Germany, provided the investigative breakthrough that previous officers had lacked. His systematic analysis of evidence recovered from various crime scenes revealed partial prints that matched across incidents separated by years, proving that the same individual had been present at multiple disappearances despite witnesses describing encounters with different women. The fingerprint evidence contradicted every assumption about the case, suggesting either an impossible longevity or a deliberate deception that had fooled law enforcement for generations. The detective's methodical approach to cross-referencing cases uncovered disturbing patterns in the timing and selection of victims. His database, compiled through over 200 interviews between 1956 and 1970, revealed that disappearances consistently spiked during periods of increased prison releases, economic hardship, and seasonal migration of transient workers. Each victim fit an identical profile: adult males traveling alone, carrying visible cash or valuables, with limited family connections who might report them, missing quickly enough to trigger immediate investigation. Dunphy's 1956 forensic breakthrough came through collaboration with Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a soil analyst from McGill University whose techniques had been developed for wartime grave detection. Dr. Sinclair's examination of soil samples from the Blackthorne property revealed human bone fragments buried in distinct layers, suggesting regular disposal of human remains over multiple decades. Chemical analysis of the soil showed deliberate use of lime and other accelerants to speed decomposition, indicating the perpetrators possessed sophisticated knowledge of body disposal techniques acquired through extensive experience. The scientific evidence painted a picture of systematic murder that shocked even experienced investigators. Soil core samples taken from various locations across the property contained bone fragments from at least 18 different individuals, with carbon dating results indicating deaths spanning from the 1890s through the 1940s. Dr. Sinclair's report noted that the burial sites were arranged in a grid pattern, suggesting the property had been divided into designated disposal zones to maximize efficiency and minimize the risk of accidental discovery. Marcus Blackthorne's military service records, obtained through federal channels, revealed training in theatrical makeup and costume design that explained the family's ability to maintain their generational deception. His Army personnel file documented specialized instruction in camouflage techniques, prosthetic application, and voice modulation, skills that would prove essential for assuming female identities convincingly enough to fool experienced law enforcement officers. His commanding officers' evaluations praised his attention to detail and ability to maintain complex disguises under pressure, qualities that took on sinister significance once his true purposes were understood. The psychological evaluation conducted during Marcus's Army service revealed a disturbing combination of high intelligence and complete lack of empathy that created the perfect profile for a systematic killer. Military psychiatrist Dr. James Morrison's confidential report described a subject who viewed human relationships as strategic opportunities rather than emotional connections, demonstrating an ability to manipulate others' perceptions while maintaining complete emotional detachment. The evaluation's conclusion warned that Marcus possessed the intelligence and psychological flexibility to excel in any field requiring deception and manipulation of human behavior. Dunphy's surveillance operation intensified after discovering that Marcus had assumed leadership of the family enterprise following Rebecca's death in 1945. Property tax records showed Marcus had immediately begun expanding the underground facilities, ostensibly for root cellars, but built to industrial specifications that suggested far more sinister purposes. Building permits filed under false names revealed construction of reinforced concrete chambers, industrial ventilation systems, and specialized drainage designed for processing large quantities of biological material. The 1961 telephone surveillance breakthrough provided the most damning evidence yet of the family's ongoing criminal activities. Bell Canada records subpoenaed during the investigation revealed that calls had been made from the Blackthorne property to Dorchester Penitentiary requesting information about prisoner release schedules. The calls were made using falsified credentials, claiming to represent various religious organizations offering rehabilitation services, allowing Marcus to obtain detailed information about which inmates would be released, when, and their likely travel routes toward the American border. Prison administrative records confirmed that the caller had specifically requested information about inmates with limited family connections and histories of violent crime, demographics that would make their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate investigation. Warden Charles Mackenzie's testimony during the 1970 trial revealed that the Blackthorne family had been providing this charitable service for over 20 years, with prison officials actually referring released inmates to the property as a safe temporary shelter during their transition back to civilian life. Dunphy's 1967 investigation of the property's financial records uncovered evidence of systematic profiting from the murders. Bank records from 3 different institutions revealed regular deposits of cash and valuables that corresponded with documented disappearances, suggesting the family had been funding their operation through robbery of their victims. The deposits were made under multiple false identities across several provinces, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of banking regulations designed to avoid detection of unusual financial activity. The financial evidence revealed the true scope of the Blackthorne criminal enterprise, which had generated thousands of dollars in untraceable income over 8 decades. Property improvement records showed the family had used victim assets to fund continuous upgrades to their killing facility, purchasing specialized equipment through shell companies and false identities to avoid creating connections to their legitimate identities. The money trail provided concrete proof that the murders were not crimes of passion or religious delusion, but calculated business operations designed to generate profit while eliminating witnesses. The 1968 surveillance breakthrough came when Dunphy documented delivery of specialized butchering equipment to the property, ordered through industrial suppliers using currency traced to missing persons' wallets. The equipment manifest included bone saws, industrial meat grinders, and chemical processing tanks designed for large-scale biological waste disposal. Each piece of equipment was paid for with cash that forensic accounting later matched to specific victims, providing direct evidence linking the family's purchases to their crimes. Dunphy's final surveillance report detailed the construction of a new underground facility that represented the pinnacle of the family's killing operation. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a complex network of chambers connected by reinforced tunnels, designed with multiple escape routes and hidden entrances that would allow the perpetrators to disappear quickly if discovered. The facility included holding cells, processing areas, and storage chambers arranged with military precision, demonstrating Marcus's application of his Army engineering training to creating the perfect murder facility. The detectives' accumulated evidence files contained over 800 individual pieces of documentation spanning 20 years of investigation, creating an overwhelming case for prosecution once the opportunity arose. His systematic approach had documented every aspect of the Blackthorn operation from victim selection through final disposal, providing prosecutors with the concrete evidence needed to secure convictions despite the family's decades of successful deception. The files represented the most comprehensive investigation of serial murder ever conducted in Canadian history, setting new standards for evidence collection and analysis. The investigation's final phase revealed that Marcus had been monitoring police radio frequencies and maintaining detailed surveillance of law enforcement activities, allowing him to anticipate and avoid detection for over 2 decades. Electronic equipment recovered from the property included professional-grade radio scanners, frequency analyzers, and recording devices that provided advance warning of any official interest in the family's activities. This technological sophistication explained how the Blackthorn operation had survived multiple investigations and continued expanding even under increased scrutiny from federal authorities. The July 12, 1970, escape from Dorchester Penitentiary began at 3:47 in the morning, according to prison logbooks recovered during the subsequent investigation. 5 inmates had spent months planning their breakout, utilizing construction work assignments to map guard rotations and identify vulnerable points in the facility's security perimeter. Thomas Mullins, the acknowledged leader at age 41, had orchestrated the escape with military precision, cutting through reinforced wire fencing using tools stolen from the prison workshop and cached in locations that avoided detection during routine cell inspections. The escapees' profiles, documented in their prison files, revealed exactly the type of victims that Marcus Blackthorn had been hunting for decades. Richard Carver, 28, was serving 15 years for armed robbery with a history of violence against law enforcement. Vincent Torres, 34, had been convicted of second-degree murder after killing a rival gang member in a knife fight. Anthony Breslin, 26, was a career car thief with connections to organized crime families in Montreal. John Lee Parker, 39, was a professional burglar whose skills in breaking and entering had made him valuable to the escape plan. Marcus Blackthorn's monitoring of police radio frequencies had given him advance warning of the breakout within hours of its discovery. RCMP communication logs show that emergency broadcasts began at 6:15 in the morning, providing detailed descriptions of the escapees and their likely escape routes toward the American border. Blackthorn's radio equipment, later recovered from the property, included frequency scanners capable of intercepting encrypted law enforcement communications, giving him access to information about police deployment patterns and search strategies that allowed him to position himself perfectly to intercept the fleeing convicts. The trap was set with the precision of a military operation utilizing 8 decades of accumulated knowledge about human psychology and predatory behavior. Blackthorne had positioned himself along the rural road, most likely to be used by escapees avoiding highway checkpoints, wearing his perfected elderly widow disguise that had fooled law enforcement officers for over 25 years. His grandmother's clothing, preserved and maintained since the 1930s, provided authentic period details that enhanced the illusion of a harmless old woman who had lived in isolation since Victorian times. The escapees' encounter with the disguised Blackthorne was recorded in detail through John Lee Parker's subsequent testimony to investigators, providing the first eyewitness account of the family's hunting methods. Parker's statement described how the group had been walking along the rural road when they encountered what appeared to be a frail, elderly woman hanging laundry in her front yard despite the early morning hour. The woman had immediately offered them shelter, claiming she had been expecting troubled souls to seek her help based on divine guidance she had received during her morning prayers. Parker's testimony revealed the psychological manipulation techniques that had allowed the Blackthorne family to lure victims for generations without resistance. The disguised Marcus had presented himself as a devout Christian widow who had dedicated her life to helping society's outcasts, offering not just shelter, but spiritual redemption for men who had lost their way. His performance included detailed knowledge of prison conditions, rehabilitation programs, and the psychological struggles faced by recently released inmates, information gathered through decades of contact with previous victims. The group's decision to accept the offer was influenced by their desperate circumstances and Blackthorne's masterful portrayal of helpless vulnerability. Prison records show that all 5 men had histories of violence against authority figures, but maintained codes of conduct that prohibited harming elderly women or religious figures. Blackthorne's disguise exploited both psychological weaknesses simultaneously, presenting a target that appeared too harmless to represent any threat while offering exactly the type of sanctuary that desperate fugitives would find irresistible. The interior of the Blackthorne farmhouse provided the final elements of deception needed to lower the escapees' guard completely. Parker's detailed description of the house revealed a carefully maintained museum of Victorian domesticity, complete with period furniture, religious artifacts, and photographs dating back to the 1800s that supported the illusion of a woman who had lived in the same location for nearly 8 decades. The attention to historical detail was so complete that even Parker, whose criminal background had taught him to recognize deception, was convinced of the woman's authenticity. The transition from sanctuary to death trap occurred when Blackthorne offered the men a safe place to rest in the large barn behind the house, claiming that previous visitors had found the accommodations comfortable and secure from law enforcement detection. His suggestion that they could remain hidden for days or even weeks while the manhunt moved to other areas appealed to the escapees' need for long-term safety rather than temporary shelter. The barn's exterior appearance supported this narrative, presenting the facade of a typical agricultural building that would attract no official attention. Parker's account of entering the barn revealed the true horror of the facility that Marcus had spent decades perfecting. The interior had been completely rebuilt to serve as an industrial-scale killing ground, equipped with reinforced steel cages designed to hold multiple prisoners, hydraulic restraining devices, and specialized equipment for processing human remains. The walls were lined with personal effects from previous victims arranged as trophies, including hundreds of photographs, pieces of jewelry, and identification documents that represented decades of systematic murder. The killing began within minutes of the group entering the barn, according to Parker's sworn testimony that provided investigators with the first detailed account of the Blackthorne family's methods. Marcus had shed his elderly woman disguise to reveal his true appearance, a giant standing 6 feet 8 inches tall, his body deliberately scarred and mutilated to create a monstrous appearance designed to terrorize victims into complete psychological submission. His gigantism condition, inherited from his mother's side of the family, had been weaponized through years of cultivating an inhuman appearance that combined physical intimidation with psychological warfare. The systematic execution of the other 4 escapees demonstrated the industrial efficiency that Marcus had developed through decades of practice. Parker's testimony described hearing his companions' screams as they were processed through the facility's restraining systems, their deaths prolonged to maximize both Marcus's enjoyment and the terror of the surviving prisoners. The killing ground included recording equipment that preserved the sounds of victims' final moments, creating an audio archive of suffering that investigators would later discover contained hundreds of hours of recorded murders spanning multiple decades. Parker's escape through a damaged roof slat represented the first failure in the Blackthorn killing operation in over 80 years of successful murders. His background as a second-story burglar had taught him to identify structural weaknesses in buildings, skills that proved essential when he noticed loose boards in the barn's ceiling during the chaos of his companions' murders. The roof damage had been caused by the previous winter's storms, but had gone unrepaired because Marcus never expected any victim to survive long enough to require such detailed knowledge of the facility's construction. The evidence recovered from the crime scene provided investigators with concrete proof of 8 decades of systematic murder that had been hidden through elaborate deception and community manipulation. Crime scene analysis documented 127 pieces of physical evidence linking the Blackthorn family to disappearances dating back to 1892, including the detailed murder journal that had been maintained by 3 generations of killers. The journal's entries provided explicit descriptions of victim selection criteria, killing methods, and disposal techniques that had been refined over nearly a century of criminal activity, finally giving investigators the documentation needed to expose the full scope of the family's crimes and ensure that justice would be served. Marcus Blackthorn's arrest on July 15, 1970, marked the beginning of the most comprehensive serial murder prosecution in Canadian legal history. RCMP investigators had finally gathered enough evidence to charge him with 23 counts of first-degree murder, armed with John Lee Parker's eyewitness testimony and 8 decades of accumulated physical evidence that painted an undeniable picture of systematic killing. The arrest warrant detailed specific charges for each identified victim, supported by forensic evidence that connected Blackthorn directly to murders spanning from 1892 through 1970. The 1971 trial at New Brunswick Provincial Court attracted international attention as prosecutors presented evidence of the longest-running criminal conspiracy in North American history. Crown Attorney Robert Mackenzie's opening statement promised to reveal how 3 generations of killers had operated in plain sight, protected by elaborate disguises and community manipulation that had fooled law enforcement for 8 decades. The prosecution's evidence included the complete murder journal maintained by the Blackthorn family, containing detailed accounts of victim selection, killing methods, and disposal techniques that demonstrated premeditation and systematic planning. Marcus Blackthorn's confession, delivered during the trial's 3rd week, provided investigators with answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. His testimony revealed the family's twisted belief system, which cast them as divinely appointed cleaners, removing society's undesirable elements through systematic murder. Court transcripts show Blackthorn describing his victims as God's unwanted children, whom his family was called to cleanse from the earth, justifying 8 decades of murder through religious delusion that had been passed down through 3 generations. The confession's most chilling revelations concerned the family's operational methods, which had been refined over nearly a century of criminal activity. Blackthorne detailed how each generation had contributed improvements to their killing facility, from his great-grandmother Verity's primitive disposal methods to his own industrial-scale processing equipment. His testimony described the systematic documentation of each murder, including photographs, audio recordings, and detailed written accounts that the family had maintained as both operational records and personal trophies. Dr. Margaret Sinclair's forensic testimony provided scientific evidence that supported every aspect of Blackthorne's confession. Her analysis of soil samples from the property had identified bone fragments from 23 different individuals, with carbon dating results confirming deaths spanning 8 decades. The forensic evidence included chemical analysis proving the deliberate use of lime and industrial acids to accelerate decomposition, demonstrating the systematic approach that had allowed the family to dispose of hundreds of victims without detection. The identification process for the victims required unprecedented cooperation between multiple law enforcement agencies and forensic specialists. Detective Sergeant Harold Dunphy's systematic database of missing persons reports provided the foundation for matching recovered remains with specific disappearances, while dental records and personal effects recovered from the property allowed investigators to confirm the identities of individuals who had been missing for decades. The victim identification team ultimately confirmed the names of 23 murder victims, though evidence suggested the actual total was significantly higher. The trial's most dramatic moment came when the prosecution presented the complete collection of victim trophies recovered from the Blackthorne property. Evidence tables filled the courtroom with hundreds of personal effects that the family had preserved as mementos of their crimes, including jewelry, photographs, identification documents, and personal letters that represented the final remnants of lives destroyed by systematic murder. Each item had been cataloged and matched to specific victims, providing concrete proof of the family's guilt that made denial impossible. Marcus Blackthorne's sentencing hearing on December 8, 1971, resulted in life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available under Canadian law. Judge William Morrison's sentencing statement described the Blackthorne crimes as representing the most systematic and prolonged criminal conspiracy in Canadian history, noting that the family's deception had enabled them to operate with impunity for 8 decades. The sentence ensured that Marcus would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent victims, finally ending the murderous legacy that had claimed lives across 3 generations. The physical destruction of the Blackthorne property in 1972 eliminated the last traces of the family's criminal enterprise. Demolition crews working under provincial supervision razed all structures and filled in the underground facilities that had served as killing grounds for nearly a century. The land was converted to a provincial wildlife preserve, ensuring that the site would never again be used for human habitation, while providing a peaceful memorial to the victims who had suffered there. The preservation of complete case files in the New Brunswick Provincial Archives created a permanent record of the investigation that would serve future law enforcement training and academic research. The archived materials included crime scene photographs, trial transcripts, forensic reports, and the complete Blackthorne family murder journal, providing scholars and investigators with detailed documentation of how systematic serial murder could operate undetected for generations. The archives also maintained audio recordings of Marcus Blackthorne's confession, ensuring that his admissions of guilt would be preserved for historical purposes. John Lee Parker's post-trial advocacy work transformed the tragedy of his experience into positive change for law enforcement and victim protection. His detailed knowledge of prison security weaknesses led to procedural changes in how escape attempts were prevented and manhunts conducted, while his testimony about the Blackthorne family's methods influenced training programs for investigators dealing with serial murder cases. Parker's advocacy ensured that the deaths of his fellow escapees contributed to preventing similar tragedies in the future. The final chapter of the Blackthorne case was written with Marcus's death in Kingston Penitentiary on November 22, 1994, ending the last connection to a criminal enterprise that had terrorized rural New Brunswick. For 8 decades, prison records show he maintained his religious delusions until his death, continuing to insist that his family's murders had served a divine purpose. His death certificate listed natural causes, though he had spent his final years in protective custody after receiving numerous death threats from other inmates who considered his crimes particularly heinous. The memorial stone erected in Sackville Cemetery in 1975 bears the names of all 23 identified victims, finally giving them the dignity and recognition that had been denied them in death. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of those lost to evil, justice served," providing closure for families who had waited decades for answers about their missing loved ones. The Blackthorne case stands as permanent proof that no matter how cleverly concealed or long perpetuated, systematic evil will ultimately be exposed through persistent investigation and the courage of those who refuse to let victims be forgotten. Justice was finally and completely served.